You know, when we talk about American rights, we tend to think of them as these ancient, unchangeable rules, almost like they're carved in stone. But what if I told you the real story is, well, a lot messier? It's more dynamic, more debated, and honestly, it's a story that's still being written. I mean, we all know the hits, right? Freedom of speech, right to a fair trial. You know the list. They feel like the absolute bedrock of American freedom. But what if the document we hold so sacred was actually an edited version? A condensed version of a vision that was, in some ways, way more radical and completely different from what we ended up with. That's what we're going to dig into.
So, to really get a sense of what was left on the cutting room floor, we've got to start with what actually made it in. And there is no better example than one of the most talked about, most debated rights in American life.
Okay, here it is. The final official text of the Second Amendment. Just 27 words. But man, have these 27 words launched a million arguments. Thing is, this wasn't how it was originally written.
What's so fascinating here is what got cut. Look at James Madison's original proposal. He actually included a line for conscientious objectors. You know, people who were religiously scrupulous of bearing arms. That whole idea? Just gone. Congress chopped it right out. It might seem like a small change, but it really makes you think. If they cut that, what else did they cut?
And this right here is where the story gets really interesting. Because those 10 amendments we all know and love, they were not the whole picture. Not even close. Get this. James Madison didn't show up to Congress with 10 amendments. He showed up with 20. So the Bill of Rights that we have today is literally half of what he originally wanted. And some of these lost amendments were huge, game-changing ideas. For starters, Madison wanted a kind of pre-Preamble that would have put the ideals of the Declaration of Independence right at the top of the Constitution. Can you imagine? Then there was this one, which is just mind-blowing. He wanted to make sure key rights like freedom of the press and trial by jury applied to the states, not just the federal government. That idea was so far ahead of its time, it took more than a century for it to really happen. He even wanted to edit the amendments directly into the Constitution instead of just tacking them on at the end. These weren't just minor edits. They would have totally changed how the whole document looked and felt. Okay, so let's jump in our time machine. The story of our rights doesn't stop in 1791. Let's fast forward about 150 years. The country's in the middle of a world war, and the president at the time, FDR, starts arguing that those original rights just weren't enough anymore. This quote really gets to the core of what Franklin D. Roosevelt was thinking. He believed that you can't really be free. You can't have that pursuit of happiness if you don't have basic economic security. To him, political rights were only half of the equation. So in 1944, he proposed this radical idea, a second Bill of Rights. And this was a totally different beast. It wasn't about what the government couldn't do to you. It was about what the government should do for you. The right to a job, to a decent home, to medical care, to a good education. I mean, this was a complete rethinking of what the word right even means. But, you know, the story of American rights isn't just about adding new ones. It's also about the constant struggle to figure out what the ones we already have actually mean. And man, there's no better example of that than the amendment that abolished slavery. So, after the Civil War, the 13th Amendment made slavery illegal. Great. But in a lot of places, new forms of forced labor popped up almost immediately. One of the worst was called peonage, which was basically debt slavery. Imagine this. A farm worker is told they owe their boss money for food and a place to sleep. Then they're told they're legally not allowed to leave until that debt is paid off. A debt that, surprise, surprise, never seems to go down. So the courts had to answer this really important question. Does the 13th Amendment just outlaw slavery as an institution, or does it outlaw any kind of forced servitude like this? And this timeline just shows you the tug of war. It's incredible. For almost 100 years after the amendment was passed, the Supreme Court kept interpreting it really narrowly. They basically said it didn't give Congress the power to stop private discrimination. But then, bam, 1968. Right in the middle of the civil rights movement, the court does a complete 180. In this huge case, Jones v. Mayer, they said that refusing to sell a home to a black family because of their race wasn't just discrimination, it was a badge and incident of slavery. And just like that, they decided Congress absolutely did have the power to ban it. The words of the amendment never changed, but their meaning, their power, was totally transformed. So here's the big takeaway from all that. A right is basically a living thing.
Its real power, its actual scope, depends completely on how we, as a society, decide to interpret and enforce it in any given generation. And this whole process of defining and redefining our rights isn't just some dusty old history lesson. It is happening as we speak, in our politics, in our courts, everywhere. So let's circle back to the Second Amendment and see how this plays out today.
Let's look at one specific, modern take on this. This document comes from Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign, and it lays out a very clear vision for what the Second Amendment should mean in practice, right now. It's a perfect snapshot of one side of this ongoing debate.
So what's the game plan here, according to this view? Well, you can see a few main themes. First, the idea is to really enforce the laws we already have, rather than create a bunch of new ones. Second, there's a huge emphasis on fixing the mental health system. And when you get to things like gun bans or new background checks, the position is pretty clear. Oppose new restrictions, and instead, focus on fixing the systems that are already in place. And finally, there's this call for a national right to carry, the idea that a permit from one state should work in all 50. It's a perfect example of how that one sentence from 1791 is constantly being translated into very specific, very modern policy debates.
So when you put it all together, from the amendments that almost were, to these radical ideas for new economic rights, to the century-long battles over what a single sentence even means, it's pretty clear that the story of American rights is far, far from over. And this, right here, really gets to the heart of the whole thing. It all boils down to this one fundamental question. What even is a right? Is it a shield from the government, like the original Bill of Rights that says Congress shall make no law? Or is it a foundation provided by the government, a set of guarantees like FDR's idea of the right to a useful job? There's no easy answer. This is the central, unfinished conversation that we're still having in America. Which brings us right back to the beginning. That stone monument isn't finished. The story is still being written. And it turns out every generation gets to hold the pen. So the real question isn't for historians or lawyers anymore. It's for you. What comes next?